Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor Finley, and I'm going to be talking today about the movement in Rojava in northern Syria, as well as in southern Turkey, Bakır, Kurdistan. And I'm not going to get the chance to explain more than sort of the basic contours of this movement, and I'm sort of going to make some basic assumptions that you've read about this movement in the news, maybe sort of the connection between social ecology and Murray Bookchin's writings in particular attracted you to come here and learn a little bit more. That's sort of what I'll be talking about today. So, as mentioned, Eleanor Finley. I am a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, and sort of like Dan and having an anthropology background, it informs my interest in social ecology, but I came to the Institute in 2011 before I sort of ended up getting funneled into graduate school. After being, or sort of in the midst of being a part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I was an activist before that. I'm from Virginia and was sort of involved in Southern LGBTQ organizing. I got involved in social ecology through Haya Heller, who couldn't be here with us today, unfortunately. She's been a real mentor to me. And sort of through that moment in 2011 around Occupy Wall Street, I was also very interested in the Quinceañera movement in Spain, which is very similar to Occupy Wall Street. I started becoming interested in social ecology and these ideas. And I started following the Kurdish question, as it's sometimes called, in late 2012, early 2013. And I remember, I think Brian told me in sort of this offhanded way, like, oh, we've heard that there are these, there's these folks in Eastern Turkey and they're reading Bookchin and they're trying to put these ideas into practice. And we're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. That's like, a little out there. And then slowly that seed sort of grew into this movement that's inspiring a lot of people on the left. And inspiring a lot of people who aren't on the left, and maybe that's what's sort of most exciting about it. Time for myself, and I really think in the revolution in Rojava and the Kurdish movement, it's very complex, it's contradictory, and it's sort of it's in some ways it's like the hot issue right now. But I think it's not just that people are, surprised to see leftism in the Middle East, which actually there's a long history of leftism in the Middle East. But I think we see this energy because it's really the first movement of its kind, really ever. And that comes in part from social ecology. It comes from a lot of other sources. So what I'll do sort of throughout the rest of my talk is to pull on some of the principles that Dan mentioned and how the Kurds are sort of invoking these principles and making something, again, that really, as far as I can see, maybe since the Paris Commune, I'm not sure, in some ways haven't really been seen before. And those three principles that I'm really going to talk about here are unity and diversity, the creation of a political sphere, really at the municipal level that Bee just talked about so wonderfully. And then the third principle, I guess I would call like a utopic sensibility. They sort of, in Haya Heller's work, she discusses the concept of eros and desire, and how sort of this striving through culture, through our sensibility. It's really sort of the third principle. And if I have time, I'd also like to touch on education, because that's a very important component as well. So just briefly to cover the Kurdish movement, for those of you who maybe are less familiar with it, the Kurdish people are a minority living in the Middle East. They're the largest stateless minority in the world. There are 30 million people spread out over 4 different countries. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they kind of got short shrift. And everybody else got a country, and the Kurds are just kind of sitting in the middle of it. Geologically and historically and culturally, the region is Mesopotamia, or sort of historic Mesopotamia. It has a long, vast history, and there's so much that I could go into. But in the late 1970s, there was a Marxist, Leninist, or I guess really sort of Maoist Third World revolutionary push. And in Eastern Turkey, sort of specifically directed at the Turkish government, they formed an organization called the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, and they were at war with the Turkish government until really 2010, I think is, it's on and off right now. It's back on, yeah. Right now the violence has sort of restarted, and it's like you never know when to wait or to keep going. One of their political leaders named Abdullah Öcalan was imprisoned in 1999 by NATO. He started reading Bookchin, as well as Foucault, as well as Wallerstein, as well as Hannah Arendt, and in many other thinkers, many Arabic, Turkish thinkers that I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. And he started developing his own sort of holistic theory of revolutionary change. And but sort of the backbone, in some ways, really comes from social ecology. And there's a lot you can look up into their relationship. And sort of in around 2005, 2010, they started building confederal structures in Eastern Turkey. They took this concept of confederalism, local control, a political sphere, they took it very seriously, and they said, we don't want a revolutionary state of the proletariat. The nation state has never been our friend. In fact, the state has never been our friend.
Sorry, I'm not.
That actually, Mesopotamia is the historic site where the state originated, and sort of Kurdish people have this identity of sort of being outside of the state, even from its emergence. So when social ecology, or the ideas of social ecology, started to percolate into this movement, as it started to percolate into this movement, they started a project called Democratic Autonomy. Which again, if you know sort of the details, it went on for several years. It was then ended through negotiations with the Turkish government. And speeding up until now, you see the start of the Syrian civil war, the emergence of the Canton movement in Rojava, and Canton movement. So currently, so again, this is so big and complex. So actually, can I get a show of hands? Do folks sort of understand sort of Rojava, Kurdistan, or sort of what the sort of narrative?
It's a region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a region in northern Syria, as there was sort of a vacuum of power in that country. Kurds in Rojava. So again, Rojava means sort of the land to the west. So it's the western portion of Rojava. As I mentioned, they're spread out over 4 different regions. In Rojava, the people rose up in that vacuum of power, established their own system of self-management, as they call it. They call it the self-management model. They established a series of cantons, these 3 separate regions, and they established militia self-defense units. So the people from Rojava took it upon their own hands to protect themselves against the Assad regime and against ISIS eventually. So that's sort of, and then that's the very dramatic moment where ISIS tries to, murder all of the Kurdish people. They absolutely have a genocidal agenda, and the Turkish government does as well to a certain extent. And the Canton movement is another sort of way that you're starting to see confederal politics enter into this movement. Oh am I on time?
There's a watch.
Okay, thanks. So in the last couple of years, I started following this movement. I went to Bakır, Kurdistan, I went to Turkey in 2015, last summer, right after a very sort of dramatic series of elections. And I sort of maintained collaborative relationships with Kurdish activists. I work closely with a group from Kobani who currently live in Germany, and I've gotten to sort of interview a number of people and get a sense of some ways sort of from the institutional to sort of the individual level. And again, this is all to say that it's very complex, very contradictory, and I'm not able to cover all of it here.
Sorry for interruption. You said twice contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Contradictory because there's currently a war going on with the Turkish government as well as with ISIS on sort of the other end, and there are parts of sort of the Turkish movement that are looking towards there being a state, and potentially a state that might go from southern Iraq into northern Syria. And so sort of this tension between, statist politics and non-statist politics certainly appears in this movement as well. So that's why I say contradictory, just to sort of acknowledge the romanticism that sometimes happens around movements, especially if they're in, the global south.
So you are saying that because they are trying to build their own state, that's contradictory, that they are fighting also against Turkish state?
To acknowledge that there are, Kurdish political groups and organizations that are looking to establish a state and that have been looking to establish a state, such as the sort of regional president in southern Iraq, President Barzani, just to sort of acknowledge that tension and that spectrum is certainly there. That it's not that Kurdish people aren't monolithic. So I'm gonna continue. And
we'll have
we can
plenty
do
of time
Q&A,
for more discussion once we've finished.
Yeah.
Sorry.
For your questions. So to sort of return to social ecology and the specifics of how social ecological principles appear in this movement, and appear really through a process of translation, literally across multiple languages, and also figuratively that, I think just as Kurdish people aren't monolithic, social ecology isn't monolithic. And you can sort of see these, you can see principles reemerging in different contexts and applied in creative and innovative ways. And the principle of unity and diversity you really see in the Kurdish movement, both in Syria and in Turkey, through multiculturalism, and just a very strong emphasis on bringing in all of the different ethnic and religious and cultural elements of society to participate in a political sphere. There are literally dozens of different sort of ethnic groups in the region. Again, it's very ancient. And I think it's interesting that at a time when the US, in some ways, our left is very fragmented and sometimes are you know, and I say this coming out of sort of, you know, radical feminism and queer politics, that, and sort of how we understand identity, there's a push, there's a no, there's me and us and sort of against the oppressor, but that actually in this movement that's accomplished so much, you see a real emphasis on the ecumenical and the universal aspects of revolution, that revolution and revolutionary politics really belong to everyone, and that we maintain and we retain our particular selves. And again, we can't go too far into the sort of philosophy of social ecology, but you really see a movement from the general to the particular, and you see that reflected in this movement that is very deeply committed to not just like a kind of multicultural tolerance, but a very sort of optimistic and loving embrace of people from other cultures, that there's that diversity, that social diversity creates a richness in society that that is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. And a sort of particular example you see around that is in Diyarbakir, Kurdistan, in southern Turkey. You see new monuments to Armenian people. You see new emphasis to bring in religious and ethnic minorities into municipal politics. And it's, again, to say that, this movement is complex. In Syria, you have a vacuum of the state, and the people of Rojava are sort of in this task of building society from the ground up. Whereas in Turkey, the sort of confederal politics that they practice is still in tension with the Turkish government. And so they're really, and sort of similar to, B and Murray's work in Burlington, they're exploring creative ways to bring people into politics and bring people into the municipality. And one of those is through this emphasis on multiculturalism. And moving along into sort of my second principle of developing a political sphere, as we mentioned, the Canton movement and Rojava, they have a series of confederated public assemblies. Those assemblies have quotas for certain kinds of representation, particularly around women. Women are usually, there's a quota between 40 to 50% of who's sort of participating in the assemblies and the councils. And they're confederated through delegation, which means that, so say this is our assembly and there's another room, there's their assembly, we send someone to have a confederal meeting, but ultimately that delegate comes back and we make the decision. And that's a really sort of key mechanism in a confederal politics that social ecology and the Kurdish movement advocate. I'm just checking time, about 10 minutes. So then, so in Syria, again, where you have sort of a vacuum of the state, you see these councils have been set up by the PYD. And again, this is to sort of refer to the sort of that there are sort of contradictory elements, which is, the assemblies have been set up by a military organization. And in Turkey, you see a very sort of different approach, which I found very inspiring when I was there, where they set up unions of municipalities. And that's something, that in social ecology or libertarian municipalism, we've, had a lot of experiments over the years, and this seems like a new one that they've done, where the union of municipalities is literally just creating forms of dialogue that go across different towns and villages. And they're working on sort of building that power. And then moving on to sort of the third principle of a utopic sensibility, of a sort of a principle of hope. That's a little bit harder to put into words. But, you know, I've gotten a chance to look at a number of interviews with people who participated in the Rojava Revolution and have since sort of left. And, you know, I was looking at them before sort of developing this talk, and I just kept on seeing these same words appear, like love and brotherhood and unity. And specifically in reference that when they were asked about what really was valuable to them about the revolution, like what was sort of the kernel of revolution, and they would say that, you know, people are sick of fragmentation, they're sick of alienation, and that this movement is bringing people together and celebrating the diversity of not just Kurdish society, but of the Middle East or sort of the world. And then something that goes along with that you know, I think Dan started to touch on was there's a cultural element as well, that in social ecology we see politics as an integral part of society, and that you can't really have a revolution without cultural revolution as well, a revolution in music and theater and dance, and you really see a revitalization of cultural traditions and experimentation in this movement as well. So again, to sort of, you know, to conclude, you know, going back to sort of what is the relationship between these two movements, you know, I really encourage folks here, if you're interested in what we've had to say, if you're interested in the Kurdish movement, to read a little bit of some of Murray Bookchin's work that really succinctly captures the philosophy and the politics and how they move together. I'd also encourage you to read Abdullah Öcalan, and you can see how these principles of unity and diversity and the creation of a political sphere and the need for a sort of utopic sensibility, an ethical sensibility, not just thinking about strategies and tactics and how can we, you know, how can we get this little kernel and think about the long-term vision of the society that we want later. That, you know, that sensibility, if you're really sort of interested in how those pieces all work together, I really encourage you to read their work. And the last thing I'll say, you know, we can get to Q&A. The last thing I'll say about sort of the Kurdish movement is this emphasis on education that social ecology brings. You really see that in the Kurdish movement as well. And again, you can get some of the details from their writings to understand how some of these particular principles have been translated. But education has been a really key part of social ecology. You know, I'm coming as a young person. I've had mentorship from social ecologists that has kept me involved in politics. And I think that has empowered me to be a lifelong activist. And you see this in the Kurdish movement through youth centers, through emphasis on intellectual life. People read, and if they can't read, they talk to each other. When I was in Bakr, Kurdistan, I met a woman who could tell you about Foucault. Now, she could explain knowledge power to you, but she literally couldn't read or write. And that's something that, yeah. So there's these amazing contrasts that you see in sort of the U.S. left or the left in Europe on this issue where people say, well, reading is academic. It's academic, or it's too intellectual, it's pie in the sky, it's too abstract. That actually, the real on the ground change comes from intellectual changes, and it comes from a change in sensibility, and that the kinds of intellectual development and mentorship and training that people go through in this movement. You also see the practice of what's called self-criticism, where you're sort of encircled together and you criticize yourself and you think about what you could have done differently. Those kinds of self-education and self-empowerment is so critical. So if we have more questions, we can move on to the Q&A. Thank you so much.